is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
It's political season in China as thousands of delegates and deputies converge in the capital Beijing for the annual Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference and the National People's Congress. Popularly known as the Two Sessions, the meetings mark a defining moment for the world's second-largest economy as its foremost consultative and legislative bodies chart the way forward for the coming year. So what key outcomes can be expected from 2019's Two Sessions? And what do these developments mean for other economies observing from across the world? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, Tuesday saw Chinese Premier Li Keqiang deliver the government work report, a highlight document of China's Two Sessions that spells out the country's trajectory in the past year and lays out major targets for the coming one. And as the world observes China's course in the midst of a forecasted economic slowdown, details of the government work report will now be all the more important. CGTN reporter Hu Na was at the unveiling of the government work report in Beijing and filed this report.
Setting the tone for the country's development. Premier Li Keqiang set the GDP growth target for this year at between 6% and 6.5%. He looked back at what's been achieved. GDP grew by 6.6% last year, exceeding 90 trillion yuan. He admits the country faces mounting uncertainties in the international economic landscape. He called for more innovation and vowed to deepen reform in various sectors.
We deepened reforms of state capital and state-owned enterprises and made new gains in upgrading and restructuring SOEs and in improving their quality and performance. In addressing difficulties and issues encountered by the private sector, we used every feasible means to help them address problems.
In addition to the overall macroeconomy, the work report also reiterates the government's commitment to the state-owned enterprise reform and the support for the private sectors, in particular, the funding available for small and medium-sized enterprises.
I hope the government can reduce tax and fees on small and medium-sized enterprises so that they can make profits.
In laying out future tasks, Premier Li vowed larger-scale tax cuts. The government will deepen the value-added tax reform, reducing the current rate of 16% in manufacturing and other industries to 13%, and lower the rate in transportation, construction, and other industries from 10 to 9%. He promised to further open up and foster international economic cooperation and competition.
We will open more sectors and improve the scope of opening up, continue to promote opening up based on flows of goods and factors of production, and give greater emphasis to opening up based on rules and related institutions.
Policymakers will seek to create 11 million jobs this year, and the surveyed unemployment rate in urban areas will be kept at around 5.5%. The spillover effect of interest rate hikes in the United States and uncertainties arising from trade disputes among major powers risks driving down global economic and trade growth this year. Li admits that China, as a result, will face challenges, making these targets set today all the more important. Hu Na, CGTN, Beijing.
That was Hu Na. Now to help us understand the significance of China's Two Sessions and unpack the developments coming out of the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, I'm joined by Professor Xu Xinduo. He's a senior fellow at Panguo Institution and co-author of The Rise of China and the Real Western World. In Johannesburg, Dr. David Monyai, he is the co-director of the Confucius Institute at the University of Johannesburg. And in studio with me is Professor Peter Kagwanja. He's the Chief Executive Officer and founder of the Africa Policy Institute. Gentlemen, thank you for joining in the discussion. Professor Shushindo, I'll start off with you because Premier Li Keqiang delivered the government work report to the second session of the 13th National People's Congress in Beijing on Tuesday. First, briefly give us the main messages of the report.
Well, of course, the number one issue people are focusing on is really about the growth target for 2019, the current year. That is 6 to 6.5%, a range of economic growth for the whole year, a bit different from last year. Say it's around 6.5%. And secondly, it's about the major policies basically mapped out by the government to help the private sector or the overall economy to weather this, the shocks and the challenges both domestically and externally. There's a lot of tax cuts, there are fee deduction or reduction. The total amount of that is about 2 trillion yuan, about 300 billion US. And then it's about the creation or cultivation of a better market mechanism that is more transparent, that is fairer, that is a national treatment. So to create more competition, a healthy economy, let's say. And then there are, it touches upon people's daily life, livelihood. It's about the jobs, the creation of more jobs. And also it's about, even the rates of the mobile phone, of the internet, things like that. That's more related to daily lives of the people. Yes.
Right. Dr. Monyai, to you though, the two sessions are now an annual event here. What is interesting in this for you? Why do you follow the two sessions?
I think for me, I think it is a well-organized national plan discussion in which Chinese leadership assures its own people in terms of the economic direction of the country, as well as how opening the country with the certain targets that the country has. For instance, it has the poverty alleviation by 2020, which is next year. I think these sessions really gives a clear platform to show how the government programs are reaching those milestones of the nation, looking ahead to 2049 centenary for China.
Prof, your take on this, what areas are you keen on?
Well, I think the spirit of the whole budget is interesting because it's a very deliberate attempt to balance between, expanding the economy and at the same time funding the welfare services. And you can see that balance is struck there. And for me, from the African continent, it is basically how a big power like China and a very stressful situation or global environment with a challenge by the US in terms of trade barriers and so on, how it is trying first to stabilize its economy, to continue opening up, as part of its larger economic reform, and 3, to continue funding and expanding opportunities for its citizens in terms of welfare, job creation and employment expansion, the issue of environment, ensuring that the growth itself is within the framework of healthy environment.
Right, and we're going to look at that stabilizing of the economy and the growth of the economy because, Professor Shu, the government report covers a wide range of issues. In terms of economic growth, though, China has set its growth rate at between 6 and 6.5% for 2019, slightly lower than 6.6% for 2018. What does this mean, though? Does it mean that China's economy is losing momentum?
I have to admit that yes, there are challenges. There are shocks within the market, and also the uncertainty amid the rising protectionism and the unilateral approach, like by United States, the tariff war, etc. But at the same time, if you look at the range of economic growth, that's from 6 to 6.5%. On one hand, I think it gives the government more flexibility, more room to maneuver in terms of achieving the target. Secondly, if you break down the numbers, you would find the Chinese economy is transforming itself in terms of the growth from relying on export and heavy investment to more about consumption and the service sector. And if you look at the three industries, basically the primary industry, it's about about 5% growth last year, and then the secondary industry, that is about 6 to 7%. And if you look at the consumption, the service sector, it's more than 10, more than 9, between 9 to 10%. So that's about 52% of the GDP growth. So the economic growth is more relying on the consumption or the service sector, which means it will be more sustainable, it will be more stable. So the quality, I would say, is improving in terms of the previous, rapid growth, often double-digit, right, in the past.
Right, and of course, Professor Kagwanja, China is Africa's largest trade and investment partner, and that is slight slowdown in economic growth. Of course, many on the continent are looking at that. What does this mean, though, for Africa? Does it mean that there'll be a slowing down in investment, such as in projects like the Belt and Road, which is now opening up the continent?
And I think I wouldn't be as pessimistic as to say that there's going to be a drastic shift. I think what China is trying to do is to stabilize its own economy, to be more accountable to its citizens by way of expanding social services, reducing taxes for the population. And what that will mean is that less taxation will mean ability by the Chinese to invest abroad. So I think Africa is going to experience some slowdown, but not a significant one. Also remember that the China-Africa relations is a very structured relationship. It's not an ad hoc, a kind of a knee-jerk reaction. That is what the summit last year was all about. The FOCAC summit was about pegging down the core areas of partnership and engagement between Africa and China. And more importantly, some of the trade negotiations, including funding the trade between the two civilizations, is all about stabilizing relationship so that it is predictable, it is dependable, and its results can be seen, can be predicted in regard to Africa's development. So I think the shifts and ebbs and flows in the economy may not radically affect China-Africa relations. Right.
Dr. Munyai, do you agree, though, that the shift and the ebb of the Chinese economy may not radically change the perception that Africa and China trade and investment partnerships the way they go?
Indeed. I think Addis Ababa and all African capitals must be watching the two sessions quite seriously with an aim of seeing the innovative way in which Chinese leadership is dealing with domestic challenges, regional as well as global, simultaneously. I think we all agree that there is overconsumption, overcapacity of the, look at SOEs and just general Chinese economy, and the massive movement globally, and more so on our own continent. I think the bigger question is for Africans to find ways of meeting China halfway. How to benefit out of outward investments that are reaching all parts of the world. We are not the only continent that seeks Chinese investments. Regionally, I think with overcapacity in China, your Bangladesh, your Pakistan are also competing with us in terms of getting this investment. Therefore, I think we need to look into African environment in terms of the regulatory environment to ensure that we catch on key issues. For instance, on tourism. Chinese tourists in the world in next 5 years or so, it will constitute 1/4 of the entire tourism industry. Therefore, I think Africa can benefit. One Belt, One Road, it's one area, massive infrastructure development, and ensure that we benefit and reaching out our goods, get into China and broadly in the world in terms of the global value chain. I think these are key issues that we need to be grappling as we learn from China through the annually 2 session that is ongoing in Beijing as we speak.
Right. Professor Xu, Dr. Monyai has mentioned an interesting point regarding the role of emerging markets, or how emerging markets are taking advantage of Chinese investments. Explain that balance for us, though, because China still expects to speed up growth in emerging markets. How is China going to grow its own, internal economy while still boosting growth in emerging markets?
Well, the concerns are legitimate. Let me explain. Actually, there's probably no need to be concerned that much about the Chinese economy. For example, last year, the growth rate is 6.6%. The total GDP has reached more than 90 trillion yuan, or 13.6 trillion US dollars. That's the total GDP of the Chinese economy in 2018. So the growth is basically, the addition is 1.4 trillion US dollars. That amount basically equals the size of Australian economy. So basically, at the growth rate above 6%, 6.5, 6.6, that means every year there's an addition of Australia to the Chinese economy. So the speed may be slowing a bit, but the total amount, the GDP itself, is very large. I mean, the Chinese economy is maturing, and 6%, above 6% economic growth remains outstanding. I would say the envy of a lot of economies.
Right. We'll pick up where the world and China is heading from there. Gentlemen, thank you very much to stay with us for the moment. We'll take a short break now, but do stay tuned. The conversation continues on Talk Africa in a moment. Don't go away.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington, and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms, and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
We will fully implement the 8 actions which were announced in the Beijing summit of FOCAC last year by deeply and jointly implementing the One Belt and One Road initiative. We will build a community of common destiny for both sides. China-Africa cooperation has always been open. Africa's development also needs more input from the international community. China is ready to play a big role in Sino-Africa cooperation so as to attract more countries to pay attention to, attach importance to, and invest in Africa. We should also use our own strengths and work together for peace and development in Africa.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, my guests are still with me, Professor Xu Xinduo in Beijing, Dr. David Monyai in Johannesburg, and Professor Peter Kagwanja with me in studio. Let's continue with that discussion. Professor Xu, technology and AI have been top priorities as well for 2019. China says it will further cut the rates for broadband and mobile internet services as the country steps up the push to nurture innovation and speed up the growth of emerging industries. What do developments of these technologies, though, mean for China's growth?
Well, as I mentioned earlier a little bit about the growth pattern of the Chinese economy or growth model, in the past it is mostly investment-driven or export-driven. Now it's transforming itself into an economy that is more relying on consumption and services and innovation-driven and or technology-driven. So the Chinese investment in R&D is one of the highest among the world. And if you look at the R&D of the Chinese economy, so they are also increasing. And the graduates of this science and graduates basically every year from Chinese universities, it probably is, the number is the largest. And so I think they just fit very well for the Chinese new growth model. that is focusing on technology, for example, like artificial intelligence, 5G, Internet of Things, big data. And China is one of the probably most advanced, I would say, on par with the United States in some of the technologies. So especially like AI, artificial intelligence, basically if you look at the whole world, it's China and the United States leading the way forward. So both countries have their own advantages in terms of this technology. But China has this largest number of mobile internet users. China has a big data advantage. So Chinese, I think it's a part, today's outcome is partly because of the market economy, market competition, and also the outcome of reform and opening up. If you keep, that's one of the solutions basically to the difficulties right now the Chinese economy is facing. That China is ready to further, deepening further the reforming measures, and also opening the country further to the outside world to welcome more investment, more participation from other countries.
So the technology, Professor Kagwanja, is now taking center stage in Chinese economy, though, and there is a race towards 5G. China is becoming a global leader here. So in terms of Africa, though, as the world embraces the fourth industrial revolution, where does this leave Africa?
I think at the level of technology, for the first time in many centuries, Africa is beginning to become a factor in industrialization, in technology, in science and technology. We have countries like Kenya where we have seen major innovations within the IT sector, like the electronic money transfer, which we call here M-Pesa, and so on. So I think Africa can benefit a lot from this. And China is a country that seems to be willing to share technological innovations with Africa. If we go by the resolutions of FOCAC Summit last year, where industrialization is at the top of the bar of the 8 or so areas of cooperation between China and Africa. And therefore, I think it's incumbent upon Africa to begin finding out what it can get from China in order to already expand its expanding technological innovations. One area I would suggest is to deepen the issue of technology transfer by way of training local Africans. And I think the FOCAC Summit, the resolutions were about helping Africa to acquire skills from China. And the more we take Africans to China and bring them back home as a way of advancing our own technology, the better.
Do you think, though, Dr. Monyai, that Africa can adapt to the fourth industrial revolution without necessarily having completely industrialized?
There's a great chance that given the lack of infrastructure, we have been behind on the third industrial revolution, and to some extent in some small African countries, they are even at the first industrial revolution. We can leapfrog. This gives us an advantage. What my brother, Professor Peter Kagwanja, has mentioned, what's happening in Kenya, can be taken into Congo, for instance, vast land. People are able to have these platforms in terms of money exchange, but we can go beyond that. We need to use space, for instance. You need high technology and in space to ensure that our agriculture and non-military purposes, we can develop faster. We have food security and deal with issues of health. So there are quite a number of areas in which China and Africa could learn from each other. And I think more and more for our African students entering Chinese university, more special attention should be paid on high and new technology, science and technology in particular.
Professor Kagwanja, you have some thoughts there.
Yes, and I think the challenge for Africa is not joining the fourth level of industrialization. It's how to ensure that consumption and production go hand in hand. For instance, the IT-driven economy that we are now beginning to experience is leaving behind very important sectors like agriculture and so on. And that's why I take the theme of industrialization very seriously. And China coming in to help Africa catch up in these technologies, because we need to basically build in the second and third level of industrialization in order to realize the full benefit of the fourth level of industrialization, which is technology or IT driven. And therefore, Africa need also to pay attention to the productive sector, the agriculture, local service provisions, and so on. And I think that's where China can come in terms of fulfilling the promises of the FOCAC summit last year.
Right, gentlemen, we're going to wind up in a moment, but I want to take a final comment on your key takeaways. Dr. Munyai, of course, the world is watching the political season in China. What are the takeaways here for Africa?
I think for Africa is that China has done the best it can to placate Western powers, particularly the United States, in the trade war that is ongoing, giving assurance through the opening up and assuring companies that are investing in China that they will be treated fairly. I think equally Africa needs to study and understand that the trade wars has a huge implication on their economies, and therefore wish that the two countries, United States and China, reach an agreement to limit the damage on the African economies.
Right. Professor Kagwanja, your final thoughts on the key takeaways from the political season there for Africa?
I think it's important to underline that America is China's greatest trading partner. And therefore, as China's trading partner, the conclusion of the China-US trade negotiations and positive results from there is going to benefit Africa, because we imagine a stronger China, stable economy with China. America is also Africa's partner in terms of trade, and therefore Africa will be watching to see how these negotiations progress. The positive thing is that the Chinese premier has promised to push these negotiations ahead. And for Africa, I think looking at China and the way it is grappling with the external challenges, and at the same time keeping its eye on the Chinese population, the Chinese people, in terms of their welfare, their employment, China's environment, so on, is a very inspiring lesson for those of us in Africa.
Right. Professor Xu, your final comments, though. What can we expect in the coming week out of Beijing?
Well, I think there will be, obviously, the whole time is mostly focusing on the economy, the social items over there. On the government work report by the Premier, it is very comprehensive. It touches upon every aspect of the Chinese life. Basically, there's an economic target, there are the measures to achieve that target, there are measures to spur the creation of jobs, there are measures to make sure there's better livelihood for the people. They even touch upon the, say, defense budget, things like that. So there's a lot of discussion, a lot of debates, and then with some changes, usually minor changes, there will be a final version of the government work report that will be approved. And of course, coming up, there will be other report by different, like by the China Supreme Court and other basically judicial organs that will be also debated and approved, and also the foreign investment law. That's very important. One of the highlights of the ongoing two sessions. Ultimately, it will be approved. That's the expectation. So basically, you will see the the basis now will be laid, and the whole year, the rest of the year will be about growth. Will be about quality growth, I think.
Gentlemen, we'll leave it there for the moment. Very insightful indeed. We'll leave it there for this week, but thank you to my guests for sharing your insights. Professor Xu Xinduo, Senior Fellow at Spangold Institution and co-author of The Rise of China and the Real Western World. In Johannesburg, Dr. David Munyai, co-director of the Confucius Institute at the University of Johannesburg. And in studio with me, Professor Peter Kagwanja, Chief Executive Officer of the Africa Policy Institute. Extensive coverage of the two sessions continues right here on CGTN. Remember to keep the conversation going online through Facebook and our Twitter handles. And you can also catch this and previous episodes of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist and the CGTN Africa website. Remember to tune in again next week from me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi. Goodbye.